Have you ever prayed with everything inside you and gotten nothing back? No whisper, no sign, just silence. The kind that doesn't just hurt your ears, it breaks your heart. You wonder if God's ignoring you, punishing you, or worse, if he's just not there at all. And yet, even in that deafening stillness, something holy is happening. Before we go deeper, take a moment. If you've ever felt abandoned in prayer, type Amen in the comments so you know you're not alone. And don't forget to subscribe. This journey into truth is just beginning. Because what if silence isn't God's absence, but his answer? What if silence is the voice, one that refuses to be rushed or defined by your expectations? The Bible is full of stories where people cried out, and heaven waited. Job lost everything, tore his clothes, screamed at the skies, and God didn't speak until the very end. David wrote entire psalms begging for God to show up. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? Psalm 13:1. Even Jesus, in the garden and on the cross, cried out with no reply, my God, why have you forsaken me? And yet not one of these people was forsaken. Not one was left behind. The silence did not mean abandonment. It meant something deeper was happening. A test, a formation, a divine work so sacred that words would have gotten in the way. But it doesn't feel that way when you're in it. When you fasted, worshipped, wept, and waited, and nothing breaks. The human heart starts to wonder, is this my fault? Did I sin too much? Did I miss God? And often that shame builds until you stop praying altogether. But silence doesn't always mean correction. Sometimes it means construction. God is building something in you that can only be forged in stillness. You see, words comfort, but silence shapes. When God speaks, he confirms. But when he doesn't, he deepens. He roots you, anchors you, purifies your motives, removes the noise. And in that stripping away, your faith either dies or transforms. Think of Abraham. God gave him a promise, a son. But then, years of silence. No updates, no progress, just a barren tent and aging bones. And yet Romans 4:20 says, he did not waver through unbelief, but was strengthened in faith, strengthened in the silence. Because that's where real faith grows, not in answered prayers, but in unanswered ones. Anyone can worship with a miracle, but what about without one? That's where God separates the surface believers from the rooted ones. And that's not a punishment, it's a promotion, a drawing closer. You stop seeking the gift, you start seeking the giver, and suddenly, even the silence feels sacred. But let's be honest, silence still hurts. You watch others get breakthroughs while you're stuck in the same cycle. You hear testimonies of instant healing, instant provision, open doors, while your door stays shut. It starts to feel personal. Why them and not me? And that's when bitterness sneaks in, jealousy, weariness. And if the enemy can't get you to sin outright, he'll get you to doubt silently, to smile in public but quit in private, to keep going through the motions while yous, chakaris, gesar, gali, chatari, while your heart slowly hardens, and God, in his mercy, won't let that happen. So he holds the answer back just long enough to confront what you're really worshiping. Do you love him or what he can give you? Are you trusting in him or in his timeline? Silence reveals idolatry. It exposes hidden expectations. And if you let it, it will bring you to the purest place. Even if he never answers, he's still good. That's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said in the fire. Our God can deliver us, but even if he doesn't, we won't bow. Daniel 3:18. That's real faith, the kind that doesn't bargain, doesn't flinch. It's not faith in the outcome, it's faith in God. And once you step into that, silence no longer feels like punishment. It starts to feel like preparation, because here's the mystery. God often speaks after the silence, not before. And when he does, it's clear, it's final, and it was worth the wait. Job waited through 37 chapters of agony, confusion, and silence. But when God finally spoke in chapter 38, it wasn't just comfort, it was revelation, power, restoration, and double the blessing he lost. But what if Job had quit at chapter 20 or 25? What if he assumed the silence meant the story was over? That's the danger. We mistake quietness for conclusion. But in God's world, the silence is never the end. It's the prelude, the pause before the miracle, the hush before the breakthrough. Just like a seed, buried, quiet, unseen. But inside, life is exploding, roots are growing, and one day it breaks the soil and blooms. That's what's happening to you right now, even if you can't feel it. So here's the truth. If God is silent, it's because he's doing something too deep to announce, something you're not ready to hear, something your character is still catching up to. And when it comes, it won't just answer your question, it'll define your calling. But until then, keep praying, keep pressing, keep sitting in the silence with open hands, because that stillness is not empty, it's holy. It's the place where angels gather, where identity is forged, where fire becomes fuel. God's silence isn't a no, it's a sacred not yet. And when you trust him in that, you step into a maturity that hell can't touch, a peace that circumstances can't break, and a faith that won't shake, even if the answer never comes. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel like peace. It feels like punishment. You sit alone with your prayers, your journal, your open Bible, hoping for even a whisper from heaven, and nothing. It feels like being buried. But burial and planting look the same from the outside. The difference? One ends in death, the other ends in resurrection. And when God goes quiet, he's not burying you, he's planting you. Something is taking root beneath the surface, something eternal. But roots take time, and time feels cruel when you're desperate. We live in a world that rewards speed, noise, and visibility. But the kingdom of God begins in hidden places. Moses spent 40 years in Midian, tending sheep, with no word from the God who once spared his life as a baby. David was anointed king, then sent back to the pasture with no crown, no throne, just sheep and silence. And Jesus himself, the Son of God, was hidden for 30 years. No miracles, no sermons, no spotlight, just obscurity, silence, preparation. And yet each one of them emerged from that silence with power, with clarity, with divine authority that didn't come from applause, but from the fire of waiting. That's what God is building in you. Not quick inspiration, but holy resilience. And it's in the quiet where you learn to recognize his presence, not by volume, but by stillness. Elijah didn't hear God in the wind, or the earthquake, or the fire. He heard him in a whisper. 1 Kings 19:12. Why a whisper? Because you have to lean in close to hear it. And that's what silence does. It draws you near, strips the distractions, forces you to stop performing. And in that nearness, something incredible happens. You stop praying for answers, and you start praying for alignment. Not my will, but yours. That's the prayer that breaks chains. Not because it fixes everything, but because it surrenders everything. And God always answers surrender, even if he delays the details. But silence doesn't just shape your relationship with God, it shapes your identity. When the noise is gone, the affirmations dry up, and your prayers feel like they're bouncing off the ceiling. You find out who you really are, not what others say, not what your feelings scream, but who God has called you, even when he's not speaking it again. Jesus, after being baptized and affirmed by the Father, "This is my beloved Son," was immediately led into the wilderness. No crowd, no miracles, just hunger, heat, and temptation. The first thing Satan said, "If you are the Son of God," in other words, are you really who he says you are? That's the attack that always comes in silence. Doubt, identity crisis, spiritual amnesia. Because if the enemy can't take your calling, he'll try to confuse your confidence. And silence is his favorite battlefield. But if you can hold on to what God said, even when he's not repeating it, that's where unshakable identity is forged. That's where spiritual authority is born, not from being loud, but from being rooted, when you can say, "I know who I am," even when heaven is quiet, hell trembles, because that kind of believer can't be manipulated, can't be rushed, can't be bought by feelings or fooled by delay. That's the kind of believer God is shaping in you right now. Through every silent day, every unanswered prayer, every moment of wondering, where is he? And here's the beautiful tension. While God is silent to you, he's still speaking about you. Heaven hasn't gone inactive. It's gone intentional. The silence is not a break in the plan. It is the plan. Because God doesn't waste anything. Not a tear, not a groan, not a single amen you whispered through clenched teeth. All of it is accounted for. Psalm 139, verse 16 says, "Every day of your life was written in his book before one of them came to be." That means this season of silence was already on the page. And not just as filler, but as fire. Fire that would refine your faith. Burn off the false identities. Carve space for something eternal. It's hard to see that when you're in it. But look at Joseph. Betrayed. Imprisoned. Forgotten by the cupbearer. 13 years of silence. And then, in one day, he was called to Pharaoh's palace and promoted to second in command. Did God suddenly start working? He was working all along. Behind stone walls. Behind betrayal. Behind the silence. And Joseph later tells his brothers in Genesis 50:20, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." That's what silence does. It reinterprets the pain. It redeems what was meant to destroy you. And it reveals a God who was never late, only layering the foundation deeper than you expected. Because here's the truth you must carry. If God gave you the answer too early, it would destroy you. Not because he's cruel, but because he's kind. Because the promise is only as secure as the foundation. And silence builds that foundation brick by unseen brick. You may not feel the progress, but you're becoming unshakable. Every day you choose to trust without evidence, you're stretching spiritual muscle. Every night you cry and still lift your hands in worship, you're building altar stones. And one day, when the silence breaks, because it always does, you won't just hear God. You'll know him. Not as a vending machine for blessings, but as a friend who stayed close in the shadows. As a father who loved you enough to wait. As a king who doesn't just want your prayers. He wants your heart. If God answered you the moment you cried out, would you ever learn how to stand when no one is clapping, when no one is watching, when the heavens feel closed and the earth gives no sign of favor? This is the silent training ground of the faithful, not the public stage of miracles, but the private battlefield of waiting. God is not raising performers. He's forming pillars, and pillars are built in silence. They aren't flashy, they don't move, but they hold up everything around them. That's what you're becoming in the silence. Immovable. God knows that instant answers can produce shallow roots, but silence forces you to dig, to question, to press in, to decide once and for all if you're following him for who he is or for what you think he'll give you. Because eventually, The emotions fade, the music stops, the spiritual high wears off. And if your faith was built on hype, it collapses. But if your faith was built in silence, in the lonely places, in the dark hours, in the space between amen and it is done, then no wind, no war, no whisper of doubt can tear it down. That's the kind of faith the enemy fears. And it's forged nowhere else but here. Here, where you stare at the same wall and still pray. Here, where you walk into the same job, the same doctor's office, the same empty home, and still say, God, I trust you. That trust is not weak. It's warfare. Every time you refuse to bow to the lie that says God has forgotten you, heaven records it. Every tear, every whispered I believe, every act of obedience when there's no reward in sight, it all becomes a testimony not just for you, but for generations. Look at Hannah. She wept year after year at the temple, longing for a child, while her rival mocked her and her husband didn't understand. Silence, pain, no explanation. But what did she do? She kept coming, kept praying. And when the priest mistook her silent prayer for drunkenness, she didn't lash out. She clarified her pain. I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have poured out my soul before the Lord. 1 Samuel 1:15. That's what silence does. It breaks you open, not to destroy you, but to pour something eternal out of you. Hannah wasn't just asking for a baby. She was carrying a prophet. Samuel would go on to anoint kings, to change history. But he had to be born from a woman who knew how to press through silence, who knew how to endure the mocking, the delay, the confusion. You think God is being cruel by making you wait. But what if what you're carrying is too sacred to be rushed? What if the delay is the protection? What if the silence is the sign that something holy is gestating, something history shaping? That's what Hannah teaches us, that endurance in silence births power in purpose. And she didn't just receive her child, she released him, gave Samuel back to God, because she knew what is born in surrender must return to surrender. That's what silence teaches. You stop clinging, you start consecrating. You say, Lord, even if you give it, it's still yours. That's worship, not lip service, not songs, but trust that worships with open hands. But what about when silence isn't just painful? It feels like rejection. When you know you've obeyed, you've fasted, you've given, you've forgiven, you've waited, and yet heaven still feels mute. That's when your theology has to go deeper than your feelings. Feelings will say God is distant, but Scripture says he is near to the brokenhearted. Psalm 34:18. Feelings say he's forgotten, but Isaiah 49:15 tells us, can a mother forget her nursing child? I will not forget you. Feelings say your prayers vanish into the air, but Revelation 8 shows us a vision of heaven where angels mix our prayers with incense before the throne, then pour them back to earth like fire. Your silence is not wasted. It's not forgotten. It's not being ignored. It's being stored. Like a seed in winter, it waits for the exact appointed time, not your time, his time. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says, he has made everything beautiful in its time. That means if it's not beautiful yet, he's not done. So what do you do in the meantime? You worship, you weep, you war, but most of all, you wait, not passively, not bitterly, but faithfully, with expectancy, like the watchmen in Psalm 130 who wait for the morning, because they know the sun will rise. They don't wonder if, they just wait for when. That's the shift God is producing in your spirit, from will he to when he does. That's the posture that turns silence into strength. And it's not just about you. Your silence is creating a sound that others will hear long after your breakthrough comes. People will ask how you made it, how you didn't give up, how you stayed faithful. And you'll say, because I learned to hear God even when He didn't speak. That's what this season is about. Refining your ears, quieting your soul, preparing you not just to receive an answer, but to become one. An answer to someone else's doubt, a living witness that God still works in silence, and when He finally speaks, it will be undeniable, like thunder after stillness, like light after the void, and you'll know every silent second was worth it. God's silence isn't random, it's surgical. It cuts deep to reveal motives, wounds, fears you didn't even know you were still carrying. Because when the noise dies down, when answers stop coming, when miracles delay, that's when the real you comes to the surface. And God doesn't waste that moment. He uses it, not to shame you, but to shape you, to peel away the layers that applause built and strip down to the foundation of faith. This isn't about punishment, it's about preparation, because some breakthroughs can't be carried by the old version of you. God has to burn off the self-reliance, the entitlement, the addiction to fast answers. You can't carry a kingdom promise with a microwave mindset. That's why silence lasts longer than you want, because God's working in you, not just around you. Think of Noah. He spent 120 years building the ark. No voice, no confirmation, just obedience in the face of mockery and delay. Why? Because what God was preparing him for required faith that didn't flinch, and that faith had to be tested in silence. No thunder, no signs, just wood, nails, and trust. Every plank was an act of worship. Every day was a sermon preached in silence. And when the rain finally came, Noah didn't panic, because he had already heard God long before the storm. That's what God's building in you. Storm-proof faith. Not just emotion, not hype, but the kind of quiet confidence that says, even if I don't hear Him today, I know what He said yesterday, and I'm holding on to it. But this isn't easy. Silence feels personal, and pain makes the silence echo louder. When your prayers are soaked in tears and still nothing changes, it's easy to believe the lie that God is distant or disinterested. But if distance was proof of disinterest, the cross wouldn't exist. Jesus was forsaken so you'd never have to be. And yet, even He experienced the silence. Even He asked, "Why have you forsaken me?" That should shatter every assumption that silence means sin. Sometimes silence means you're closest to your purpose, because in that silence, something eternal is being exchanged. Not answers for prayers, but flesh for spirit. You stop depending on what you see and start trusting what He said. That's what happened to Paul. In 2 Corinthians 12, he begged God to remove the thorn in his flesh 3 times. Silence. And then finally God speaks, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." God didn't remove the pain. He revealed His power in it. That's the kind of answer silence prepares you to receive. One that doesn't always change the situation, but changes you. And once you've encountered God in the silence, you'll never be shaken by surface storms again. Because you've learned the language of stillness. You've learned how to recognize His presence in the absence of sound. But how do you survive the wait? How do you keep believing when every part of you wants to walk away? You anchor yourself in truth, in the Word, in promises that don't shift with your emotions, because feelings will fail you. But Scripture never does. Isaiah 55:11 says His word never returns void. That means even if you haven't seen the result yet, it's working, it's building, it's planting. The silence is not delay, it's deep work, and God honors those who wait for him. Isaiah 40:31 says, "Those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength." That word wait isn't passive, it's active expectation. It's leaning forward, watching the horizon, not with panic, but with peace, because you know your God never lies, he never forgets, and he never fails. That's the kind of waiting silence invites, not desperation, but devotion. You stop looking at your circumstances and you start looking for his character, because if he was faithful before, he'll be faithful again. And that shift from outcome-based trust to identity-based faith, that's what changes everything. That's what silence is doing. It's detoxing your heart from shallow expectations. It's aligning you with heaven's rhythm. And once you catch that rhythm, you realize silence was never the absence of God. It was the training ground of the chosen. And what happens when the silence finally breaks? Everything, because God never speaks casually. When he speaks, mountains move, seas part, graves open. Silence may last for a night, but when God breaks it, it shifts generations. Look at Zacharias, John the Baptist's father. He doubted the angel's word, and God made him mute for the entire pregnancy. 9 months of silence, watching, waiting, reflecting. And when his mouth was finally opened, his first words weren't complaints, they were prophecy. He spoke of the coming Messiah, the dawn from on high, the redemption of Israel. That's what silence does. It prepares your mouth to speak only what heaven declares. No more idle words, no more fear-based declarations. Just power, purity, precision. That's what God is preparing in you right now. A voice that doesn't echo culture, but commands kingdoms. And that voice isn't built in noise, it's built in silence. Before every divine shift, there is silence. Not because God is unsure, but because he's setting the stage. When heaven is about to move, it often does so in whispers, not thunder. And those whispers begin in silence. Every great movement of God in Scripture was preceded by quiet. The 400 years of silence between Malachi and Matthew weren't years of inaction. They were years of orchestration. While Israel waited, empires rose and fell, roads were built, languages were unified. So, when Jesus finally came, the world was ready to receive the gospel in a way it never could before. Silence was the setup. It always is. And if you're in a season of stillness, of prayers that seem unanswered, of direction that feels withheld, it doesn't mean God is absent. It means he's arranging something far bigger than you can see. But he can't reveal it until you're ready to carry it. That's why silence takes time, because spiritual maturity is never microwaved. It's marinated, and God is patient enough to wait until the promise won't crush you, until the blessing won't replace him, until you no longer need the answer to worship. You just need him. That's the moment silence begins to shift. Not when the circumstances change, but when you do. Because God doesn't just answer to you, he answers through you. And when your heart is aligned with his, your life becomes the very fulfillment of what you used to pray for. Look at Joseph again. He wasn't just promoted overnight. He endured betrayal, slavery, false accusations, and years in prison, all without a word from God. But in that silence, Joseph didn't rot. He rose. He learned administration in Potiphar's house. He learned leadership in prison. And he learned to interpret dreams, not just his own, but others. That's what silence does. It expands your spiritual sensitivity. It trains you to serve even when no one sees. And by the time Pharaoh called, Joseph didn't just offer interpretation. He offered strategy. That kind of wisdom doesn't come from comfort. It comes from long, silent seasons of trusting God in the dark. And when Joseph stood in the palace, he didn't say, "Look what I built." He said, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer." Genesis 41:16. That's the posture God looks for. Not ego, not entitlement, but humility that's been crushed and refined in the silence. That's why the silence lingers longer than we like, because it's not just about getting you there. It's about keeping you right when you arrive. The palace is not the reward. Obedience is, and God is preparing you to carry His glory without stealing it. But what if the silence feels like it's changing you in ways you don't want? What if it's making you numb, distant, or even bitter? That's where the enemy tries to hijack silence and twist it into isolation. He whispers, "God has left you. You're alone. This is pointless." But isolation is not the same as separation. You may feel isolated, but you are never separated from God. Romans 8:38-39 declares nothing can separate you from His love. Not silence, not suffering, not even your doubt. God is not scared of your silent season emotions. He welcomes them. David, a man after God's heart, cried out constantly, "How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever?" Psalm 13:1. Job, after losing everything, said, "I cry out to you, but you do not answer me." Job 30:20. Jesus Himself on the cross cried, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew 27:46. These were not weak moments. They were holy ones, because honest cries in the silence often carry more faith than loud praises in the breakthrough. They say, "Even when I don't feel you, I'm still talking to you." And that persistence, that refusal to disconnect, is what builds unshakable communion. Because here's what silence really is: invitation. An invitation to go deeper than feelings, deeper than goosebumps, deeper than outward results. It's a summons into the Holy of Holies, the space where God isn't just heard, He's known. And to get there, you have to shed the noise, the performance, the need for immediate gratification. Silence detoxes your spirit from the addiction to now. It teaches you to wait not with impatience, but with intimacy. You stop asking, "When will He come?" And you start praying, "Lord, make me ready when you do." That's the shift. That's when silence turns into sanctification. Not because the situation is fixed, but because you're finally formed. That's when God moves. That's when the whisper returns. And when it does, it's not a suggestion, it's a commissioning. Because God doesn't just end silence with comfort, He ends it with calling. Silence is not just a season, it's a crucible, a place where the version of you that arrived cannot remain. Because if God allowed you to step into your destiny with your current fears, habits, and motives untouched, the weight of it would crush you. So He does something deeper. He turns down the volume of the world. He silences the applause. He withholds the affirmation, not because He's absent, but because He's operating. Not externally, but internally. The old self begins to die in silence. The self that depended on others' opinions, the self that needed to be seen, the self that panicked when there was no clear plan. All of that gets stripped away because the silence demands something new: stillness, not passive waiting, but active surrender. You start letting go of timelines, of blueprints, of the picture you had of what it would all look like. And in that surrender, God begins to rewrite your story, not with louder answers, but with deeper convictions. You begin to realize He's not interested in just solving your problems. He's interested in solving you, fixing what you didn't even know was broken. And that can't happen in noise. It happens when everything else goes quiet. and the only thing left is the whisper of his spirit pressing into your soul. That's what happened to Moses. Before he ever split the sea or stood before Pharaoh, he spent 40 years in Midian, in silence. No burning bush, no booming voice, just the quiet of the desert, the monotony of tending sheep, the weight of past failures haunting him. But in that silence, God was doing more than preparing a leader. He was unmaking a prince. Moses had been raised in the courts of Egypt, trained in power, strategy, and status. But none of that would be useful for leading a broken people through a wilderness. God needed to strip away the palace so Moses could carry the presence. And he did it in silence. No angels, no miracles, just the daily choice to stay, to obey, to let the silence do its work. And when the time came, when Moses was finally ready, God broke the silence with fire, a bush that burned but was not consumed, a voice that didn't command, it invited. Take off your sandals. You are standing on holy ground. Exodus 3:5. That's what silence prepares you for, the invitation into holiness, not hype, not performance, but presence. And only those who have survived the silence can carry it well. But the silence doesn't just change you, it changes how you see others. When you've walked through unanswered prayers, you stop judging people who are still in the wait. You stop offering cliches. You start offering compassion, because you know what it feels like to cry without reply, to fast without breakthrough, to believe without seeing. And that experience doesn't make you weak. It makes you weighty. It gives your voice authority, not just information. People don't need noise. They need wisdom forged in silence. They need someone who didn't just read about faith, but bled for it. Someone who didn't just preach trust, but practiced it when it hurt. That's who you're becoming, not a surface-level believer who lives from miracle to miracle, but a deep well of faith that sustains others in famine. And that's a rare thing, because many avoid the silence. They medicate it with distractions. They fill it with noise. But those who remain, those who embrace the stillness, they emerge with a clarity that cannot be taught, only caught. And when they speak, it's not loud, but it's heavy. Heaven recognizes it. Hell fears it, because that kind of voice wasn't trained in public. It was formed in secret. And perhaps that's the whole point. Silence doesn't separate you from God. It separates you for God. It pulls you out of the crowd, out of the chaos, into a place where you no longer need to be seen because you've been known. Where you no longer crave answers because you found presence. And in that place, everything changes. Your prayers shift from, do this for me, to, make me ready for you. Your worship stops being reactive and becomes constant. Not because things are perfect, but because you found peace in the waiting. And it's there, in that holy stillness, that God speaks again, not always with solutions, but with something better, with himself. And when that happens, the silence breaks. Not because the circumstances have changed, but because you have. You're no longer begging for escape. You're embracing the assignment. And suddenly, you realize the silence was never a punishment. It was a promotion, not one the world can see, but one heaven celebrates. At some point in the journey, the silence stops feeling like punishment and starts sounding like presence. It's not that the answers suddenly come. It's that you stop needing them in the way you once did. Something has shifted. You begin to hear God in the rustling of the trees, in the gentle ache of your waiting heart, in the word that now feels alive in a way it never did before. It's as if the silence has trained your spirit to detect even the faintest move of his hand. You become like Elijah, standing on the mountain, waiting for God in the wind, the earthquake, and the fire, only to find him in the still, small voice. 1 Kings 19:11 through 12. That whisper would have been missed by a man who wasn't broken down by silence, but Elijah, weary and alone, had ears tuned by wilderness. That's what silence gives you, tuned ears. You no longer need the volume to recognize his voice. You know his rhythm, his timing, his way, and once you reach that place, everything becomes holy. Every delay, every detour, every unanswered cry becomes sacred space, not because it made sense, but because God was there, even in the silence, especially in the silence. It's there, in that spiritual stillness, that Scripture begins to breathe differently. It's no longer just words on a page. It's food for survival. You read Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God," and it no longer sounds like advice. It sounds like a command for survival, because in the silence, stillness is not optional. It's your only oxygen. You realize that knowing God doesn't come from busyness or outcomes or even answered prayers. It comes from being still long enough to let Him reveal Himself to you, and that knowing changes everything. It transforms how you pray, how you respond, how you walk into rooms. People see the same exterior, but something's different. You don't flinch in the face of uncertainty. You don't chase noise. You carry stillness, because now, silence isn't just something you've survived. It's something you steward. It has become your sanctuary, the place where your spirit was rewired to trust deeper, believe slower, and obey without proof. And that kind of transformation is not common. It is rare, precious, and irreversible. Think of Jesus again. Before he began his ministry, he spent 40 days in the wilderness, not preaching, not healing, not gathering followers, just silence, just fasting, just resisting the voice of the enemy. That silence was not wasted. It was war, because in that silence, identity was being solidified. "If you are the Son of God," the enemy whispered. But Jesus didn't need to defend himself. He responded with the word, because in the silence, he had memorized the truth. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He stood firm. That's the power of a silent, seasoned soul. It doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be rooted. And that rooting doesn't come from noise. It comes from nights alone, from prayers unanswered, from tears that seem to fall without echo. And yet somehow, in the silence, your roots grow deeper than the storm can reach. So when the wind comes, you don't break. You bend. You worship. You stay. And that endurance becomes your worship. Not a song, not a sermon, but the simple act of remaining faithful in the stillness. Because faithfulness in silence is louder than faithfulness in success. Anyone can praise when the miracle comes, but it takes a rare kind of faith to keep praising when nothing changes. That's what makes heaven lean in. That's what moves the heart of God. Not your performance, but your persistence. Luke 18 tells of the widow who kept coming to the unjust judge, wearing him down with her cry. And Jesus says, "Will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones, who cry out to him day and night?" Luke 18:7. He's not offended by your repetition. He's moved by it. He doesn't tire of your voice, even when it echoes through silence. In fact, it's in the repetition that your prayers become incense. Revelation 5:8 says the prayers of the saints are held in golden bowls before the throne. That means not one word has been lost, not one cry forgotten. Every silent plea is heard, and in time, they will tip, they will pour, and what felt like silence will turn into a flood of fulfillment. But even if it doesn't come how you expected, even if the answer looks nothing like your request, the silence will have done its job. It will have made you more like him. And isn't that the point? Not just to get what you asked for, but to become who he created you to be. And becoming takes time. It takes quiet. It takes the kind of silence that strips away everything until only the essential remains. And what remains is holy. It's you, refined, renewed, and ready. Not because the silence ended, but because it was never a curse. It was a calling. What if the silence you're enduring now isn't just for you? What if it's writing a blueprint for someone else's breakthrough? Because silence, when endured with faith, becomes a map for those who come behind you. It becomes legacy. Abraham never saw the full promise, but his silent seasoned obedience laid the foundation for generations to stand on. He left Ur, wandered through Canaan, waited decades for Isaac, all without full explanations. God spoke, yes, but not with a detailed plan, just a direction. Go to the land I will show you. Genesis 12:1. That's how silence often begins, with an open-ended instruction, and what you do with that silence determines whether your life becomes a dead end or a doorway. Abraham's willingness to walk without clarity opened the covenant that birthed nations. Your silence has the same weight, because what you model in obscurity becomes inheritance for your children. When they face silence, they'll remember how you prayed anyway, how you worshiped without answers, how you forgave without apology. That's the kind of legacy silence builds, not just bold, but deep, not flashy faith, but furnace faith, the kind that holds when nothing else does. That's what made David a man after God's heart, not his victories, but his secret decisions, in caves, in fields, in hidden places where no one cheered and no one saw. It was there that David learned to worship not for performance, but for survival. Psalm after psalm was penned not from thrones, but from valleys. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? Psalm 13:1. That wasn't rebellion. It was relationship. God wasn't threatened by the question. He welcomed it, because it meant David still came to him, still trusted him enough to wrestle. Silence builds that kind of relationship. It burns away religious formalities. It invites honesty, real conversations, gut-level truth. And from that kind of communion comes legacy. David didn't just rule well. He fathered Solomon, who built the temple. But Solomon didn't learn wisdom from comfort. He inherited it from a father who wrote songs in the silence. Your legacy isn't just built in public. It's forged in every private yes you whisper in the dark, in every day you choose not to quit. And one day, someone will rise because you didn't fall. Even Jesus modeled legacy forged in silence. Before his ministry began, he didn't write scrolls or gather crowds. He withdrew. He fasted. He faced the enemy alone in the desert. Silence was his preparation. And in Gethsemane, when the weight of the cross pressed down on him, he didn't roar. He wept. He asked the Father to take the cup, and when silence was the answer, he surrendered anyway. Not my will, but yours be done. Luke 22:42. That sentence didn't echo through temples. It echoed through time. It's still changing history, because the greatest legacies aren't built in noise. They're built in surrender. And if you're in silence now, know this. Every time you choose to stay, to trust, to kneel in the dark, you are building something eternal. It may not look like legacy yet, but heaven sees it, and heaven keeps record. Because God is not only forming you, he's forging something through you that will outlive you. And the longer the silence, the deeper the foundation. So the question becomes, will you stay faithful when legacy is invisible? Will you trust God when the harvest isn't yours to hold? because that's what silence asks. Not, do you want breakthrough? But can you be obedient without it? That's what Noah did. He built an ark for decades, warning of rain he'd never seen. No revival, no crowd, just hammers and ridicule. But his silence-built obedience saved humanity. What if your obedience is doing the same? What if the very thing that feels like a delay is actually your descendants' deliverance? What if your prayers, though unanswered in your lifetime, are setting fire to someone else's altar? That's how God moves, generationally, through silence, through those who are willing to endure it, not for applause, but for legacy. And that kind of obedience, that echoes longer than any answer ever could. There comes a moment in every silent season when the temptation to quit feels louder than the call to stay. You've fasted, you've prayed, you've cried through midnight hours, you've laid down everything, and still no breakthrough, no answer, just the echo of your own faith bouncing back in your chest. It's in this moment the enemy whispers his most dangerous lie: God has forgotten you. But that lie only works if you don't know the pattern. Because the truth is, before every public release, God does a private refining. The longer the silence, the greater the assignment. Look at Joseph, betrayed by brothers, sold into slavery, falsely imprisoned, forgotten by the cupbearer. Years passed, not days, not months, years, and God said nothing. But in the silence, Joseph didn't rot. He rose, not in status, but in spirit. He became the kind of man who could carry the weight of nations. And when God finally broke the silence, it wasn't with an apology, it was with a promotion. Pharaoh sent for him. In one moment, the silence ended. But the silence wasn't wasted. It was the very reason he could be trusted. Because silence purifies your motives. It reveals what's still in you that can't go with you. Pride, control, entitlement. They all die in silence. You can't fake surrender when there's nothing left to hold on to. You can't pretend to trust when the only thing keeping you upright is his unseen hand. Silence strips the performance. It dismantles the idol of certainty. It makes you confront whether you wanted the blessing more than the blesser. And when those idols are crushed, what's left is gold, refined not in public stages, but in the unseen furnace of waiting. That's why God allows the silence to stretch, not because he's cruel, but because he's holy. He's more committed to your becoming than your comfort, and becoming takes longer than we want, but produces more than we expect. That's the tension of transformation. It feels like delay, but it's actually precision. God isn't stalling, he's sharpening, not your plans, your soul. Look at Hannah. Year after year she prayed for a child, mocked by Peninnah, misunderstood by Eli, and still no child, no word, just tears and silence. But she kept showing up, kept praying, kept pouring her soul out like water before the Lord. 1 Samuel 1:15. And when the answer finally came, it wasn't just for her. It was Samuel, a prophet, a priest, a leader for a generation. Her silent season birthed a legacy that shaped the nation. That's how God works. He doesn't just give answers, he gives assignments. And assignments are always preceded by silence. Because silence is where you learn to steward what hasn't come yet, where you learn to carry what you haven't seen, where you become a vessel fit for the weight of glory, not just the thrill of blessing. This is why some doors don't open until you're emptied of needing them, why some prayers don't get answered until you no longer idolize the outcome. Because silence isn't punishment, it's pruning. And pruning is painful, but it's also preparation. John 15:2 says, Every branch that bears fruit he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. That pruning often looks like silence, like delay, like failure, but it's actually God's faithfulness in disguise, because he sees what you can't. He knows what's on the other side of the silence, and he's too wise to give you what you're not ready to carry. That's why he holds back, not to deprive you, but to protect you, to grow you, to ready you. And when he finally speaks, when the silence breaks, it won't be for a small blessing. It'll be for a supernatural release, a moment so tailored to your faithfulness, so shaped by your surrender, that all of heaven will echo with its impact. So if you're still in the silence, don't despise it. Don't rush it. Lean in, listen, let it finish its work. Because silence isn't the end, it's the edge, the place where old identities die and new assignments are born. Where your faith grows teeth, where your worship gets weight, where your destiny stops being a dream and becomes a fire in your bones. And when that moment comes, when God finally speaks, you won't just hear him, you'll know him. And that's what the silence was always about. And now, at the end of it all, after the waiting, the wrestling, the quiet aching that once felt like abandonment, something begins to shift, not externally, internally. There's a moment when you realize you've stopped asking God to end the silence, and instead, you've started listening inside of it. That's the moment when maturity is born. You stop pleading and start perceiving. You begin to recognize that silence was not the problem. It was the path. And everything inside you that once resisted the stillness now craves it, because it was there, and only there, that you finally heard the whisper, that sacred, unmistakable voice, not booming, not loud, but unmistakably him. And what he says in the silence reshapes everything, not just your perspective, your purpose, because you're no longer chasing answers, you're carrying assignment. You've become someone who knows God, not just believes in him, someone who walks with him in the cool of the day like Adam once did in Genesis 3:8, someone who recognizes the weight of his breath more than the sound of his hand, someone who doesn't just speak to God, but walks in his rhythm. And when you reach that depth, every past silence becomes testimony, not of abandonment, but of preparation. Every unanswered prayer becomes a stone in your altar, not proof of failure, but markers of faith. You start to see your story differently. You realize the delay wasn't denial, it was development. That God didn't forget you. He formed you in the womb of silence, like Jeremiah, called before birth, like Moses, hidden for 40 years before his voice was trusted, like Esther, quiet and unknown until her silence saved a nation. These are the ones God uses, not the loudest, not the fastest, not the most visible, the ones who waited, the ones who listened when no one else did, the ones who were faithful when applause was absent and answers were delayed. Those are the ones heaven trusts. And now, so are you. Because in the silence, God was carving out not just a path, but a person. He was making you into someone who could handle the promise without being destroyed by it, someone who could carry the mantle without needing the spotlight, someone who could walk through fire and not smell like smoke, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel 3, men who didn't hear a rescue plan before the furnace, but walked into it anyway. That's what silence teaches you, to walk even when fire awaits, because the goal is no longer escape, it's obedience. The silence shifted your destination. It's not about getting out anymore, it's about getting closer. You'd rather be in the fire with God than in the palace without him. That's what silence does. It makes presence the prize. And once presence becomes your goal, everything else fades. You don't panic when answers delay. You don't flinch when storms rise, because you've learned the secret. If he's silent, he's still near. And if he's near, that's enough. That's what Paul learned in prison. He could have begged for release. He could have cursed the chains, but instead he worshiped, not because he saw deliverance, but because he knew who sat beside him in the dark. Acts 16:25 says, Paul and Silas prayed and sang hymns at midnight. No plan, no light, just faith, and heaven responded. The ground shook, doors opened, but notice, the freedom didn't come before the song. It came through it. That's what happens when you stop waiting for the silence to end and start worshiping inside it. You release heaven's sound, and that sound opens things no answer ever could. You don't just break through, you break others out. That's the legacy of silence. It doesn't just change you, it sets captives free, because people will look at your story and see not defeat, but depth. Not silence, but fire. So now, as this journey through divine silence comes to a close, ask yourself, what has the silence built in me that noise never could? What wells of patience, of discernment, of intimacy with God now run deeper because I stayed? You may still not have the answer you prayed for, but maybe, just maybe, you've become the answer someone else needs. Maybe your endurance is intercession. Maybe your waiting is warfare. Maybe your silence was heaven's strategy all along. And if that's true, then nothing was wasted. Every second in the quiet, every tear on your pillow, every moment you felt invisible, it all counted, and heaven saw it. And now, when God speaks, it won't be to start your story. It will be to reveal what he already wrote in the silence. And you'll know, without a shadow of a doubt, that every unanswered prayer was not the end. It was the entrance, not silence, but setup, not rejection, but refinement, not delay, but destiny. This is where the silence ends, not because you finally heard God, but because you realized he never stopped speaking. He was just saying something deeper, and now you're finally ready to hear it.